Hi, this is Robin, and in this video, I'm going to show some methods that you can use to either correct or alter perspective in landscape and nature photos. Now, when we're shooting landscapes or nature scenes, the lens that we use and how we hold our camera can affect the results that we end up with. So I'm going to show you some techniques to deal with three particular issues. So the first is perspective. So if you tilt your camera either up or down, you can end up getting what's called converging lines. So the tips of different things start coming towards each other at the distance, and that effect is called keystoning. Another effect that you can end up with, and it's more dependent, I think, typically on the lens you use rather than how you hold the camera, is that it can make your captured scene look perhaps less dramatic than how it looked when you were at the place in person. So your choice of focal length, either for a lens or on a zoom lens, can make scenic elements appear smaller than they were when you were out in the landscape and taking the shot. Another effect that you can end up with is barrel distortion, which is a sort of bowing in and out of the scene. And that can be very typical of something that happens when you're using an ultra-wide angle lens, for instance, but it can also happen if you're just using a regular lens and then doing a series of overlapping shots to make a panorama, for instance. So using Photoshop techniques and tools that I'm going to show you here in this video, we can help fix some of these distortions to the actual scene that you perceived and correct it back to how it impacted you or how you actually saw it. Or even if your camera did not alter the scene, some of these techniques I'm going to show you give you the flexibility to alter in Photoshop how you would have loved to have seen what it was that appeared in landscape. So again, just a reminder, my YouTube channel is focused on fine art photography. So it is not about documentary photography. Therefore, my opinion is that you can adjust images to express landscape and nature as art if you want to, and some of these tools will let you do that. So they will either let you retain the truth, but keep it as it should have been versus how the camera captured it, or it will let you take some artistic license. The thing to keep in mind with this is if you're entering photo contests and they say no alteration to your images, then please, I would just advise observe the rules and use integrity in what it is that you're doing. This is more for your personal art that you're creating for yourself or to share with others. Now, this video is, as I said, focused on correcting perspective in landscape and nature photography. I do already have another video on my channel that is focused on how to correct perspective in architectural photos. So I'd say check that out if you need to fix perspective lines in buildings, interiors, or other types of architectural structures. This one is going to be concerned more about the great outdoors. Now, in this video, I will demonstrate 4 Photoshop methods to adjust landscape and nature perspective. So the tools I'm going to cover are Transform Warp, Transform Perspective, Lens Correction, and Perspective Warp. The one last thing I'd like to mention before we get into the demos is if you'd like to be notified of future videos and have not done so already, you can click on the subscribe button below any one of my videos. And if you click on that black bell icon, that's when you'll get some notifications. Subscribing is free. It doesn't mean that you have to pay for a subscription. All it means is that whenever I post new content on my channel once or twice a month, YouTube will send you a single heads up alert. So then you'll just know it's there if you want to stay in touch and learn some new techniques. So I'd say let's get started. In the first demo, and this is the image that I'm going to use, I want to show how to alter scale using Transform Warp. And as you can see, we have this lake scene with a nice little cottage here in the foreground. And this is a stock photo, so I'm looking up here to see. It looks like Luca Bravo was the photographer, and I did get this stock from Unsplash. The one last thing I would like to do before we actually get into working with the tools is to point out how my interface is laid out since I have customized it. My layers panel is up here at the top. My properties panel is down here at the bottom, and my toolbar is docked right. And that's just so you can translate for however you have your interface set up for the tools I'm going to show you. So to get started, we obviously open up an image. I have the background layer, and I always recommend duplicating it. So drag it down to the bottom of the layers panel to the box with the plus, and we get a duplicate copy, so we're not working on the original. One of the things that I recommend that you do when you're starting to work on an image is just take a moment and decide, what is it that I want to achieve with this? If you're trying for fine art photography, what is it that you want to make an impact about this image? Now let's just analyze this, and I'm going through mine even though you're not going to work with your image, just so you know the things to look for and kinds of things to think about when you're working with your image. So in this particular image, clearly the lens that was used made this mountain appear smaller than it probably is when you think about the size of it relative to this cabin out here on the lake. So that's something, I think I might want to address when I'm working here in Photoshop. To me, this looks less dramatic than it could if the mountain was taller than it's appearing here. I think we need to restore a sense of scale and a sense of magnitude both to this mountain, and maybe even pull this up a bit here so our eyes aren't drawn, to the bright sky over there relative to this foreground cabin. Now, that said, you have to decide for your image what your goal is. Is the goal to emphasize the scenery and draw attention to the scenery? Or are you trying to rent a house or a cabin that you own on a lake somewhere? Or you want to promote travel photography and say, look at this lovely place you can go and stay. In which case you might want this cabin, if it's a travel and stay kind of a message, to be more prominent than what's surrounding it. If it's a typical landscape or nature scene, you probably want the landscape and the nature to be the stars. So I'm going to work on the premise of the landscape looking more dramatic. So let's start on the demo. So we've got our background layer active with that blue highlight. Going to go to the upper left of the interface to the Edit menu. Click on that. Come down to where it says Transform. Come to this flyout menu, and we're going to go down to where it says Warp. So Edit, Transform, Warp, and left click on that. And now we have the option tools up here at the upper left in the options bar that are available to us to work with that warp tool. So I just want to point out there's a variety. So you can split the warp and how it's applied, and that's what we're going to do in this image. And you have choices like crosswise, where you can split it just like it shows with like a grid and cut this into fours and deal with it that way. You can split the image vertically and just deal with one side or another vertically, or you can split the image horizontally, which is what I'm going to click on here, and split this scene. And when you come down after you choose one of those, what you'll see if you look at my image in the center of the workspace is you get a little pink line that I'm just dragging my mouse up and down, so you can position that pink line to where you want it. So since I want to move this grayish mountain in the background so it looks taller and more dramatic, I'm going to go just out there, and I don't want to affect this chimney here on this cabin. So I'm just going to go right about there and click. So I've just left clicked and sort of planted that pink line there. So now what I'm going to do is come to the top, so you can see there's a pink bounding box with handles around here, and we should mostly be working in this part of the image. So I'm going to left click on the left handle here and just start pulling this up for my image. And again, you have to decide for your image what you want to move. You may be working vertically versus horizontally. And it's all just trial and error. It's not like I can say move it this amount. I'm just watching my image and seeing how the elements in the scene are ending up being framed. So as I said, I liked less bright light up in this corner because it tends to pull a viewer's eyes out. And I like this kind of line back into the scene that's forming here now. Plus, I just like the idea of this being a more dramatic mountain. I'm also then, as I pull this up, watching, as I said, this mountain here to see that it's getting taller. And I kind of like that. I think it's come up enough. We haven't changed the things going on here in such a way that they would be too funky or strange or change the appearance of the scene. So once you have pulled on those handles and adjusted your image to where you want yours to be, then you click this check mark at the top of the interface where my highlighter is, left click to accept it, and you'll see all those lines go away. And now we should be back here, and I'm going to label this layer with transform warp horizontal. That was the tool that I used for that. So now let's just look and see if we made an adjustment. So I'm going to click that. So you can see it hasn't, if you watched the cabin wasn't altered. It was just the mountains that got taller, which is what I wanted. Now, I have lost, so let me just duplicate this well, I'll do it a different way. I have lost some of this framing from the branches that were here in this corner. So either you can eliminate them completely if you don't feel that you really need them, or you can experiment with doing something like going back to your background layer, left click on that to make it active, so with the blue, left click and drag that down to again add a new layer using the new layer icon. So now we have a duplicate of that original layer again. And if you left click on it and drag it, just keep the mouse button depressed up above the new transform warp layer so you can see, there we are. Now what you want to do is, obviously this is putting you back to your original image, which you don't want. So if you press your Alt or Option key and left click at the bottom of the layers panel on this square box with the circle to add a mask, we add a black mask. And in Photoshop, as you're probably aware, black hides whatever is on a layer and white reveals or shows it. So we are completely hiding that content we've just added back there by duplicating the original layer by putting a black mask. You can see we're back to how it looked right there with our transform warp. You can see I'm clicking the visibility on and off. So now it's back to looking just like it looks on this transform warp layer. If you have your mask active, so the little white frame is around it, grab your brush tool from the toolbar, right there, it's the one that looks like a paintbrush. And if you want to reveal, as I said, or show content, you have to paint with white on the black. So here's the white. You can either click on this little icon with the two-headed arrow or press your X key. I'm going to press the X key and watch what happens. See, now your white becomes your foreground color. So with your brush, and I'm using a very soft airbrush right now, on working with your mask, you can come back in and maybe try to re-reveal some of the greenery that you had in your framing. And as I said, you don't have to do that, or you can even add some other, you're into compositing and things like that. But just to show you an idea of you can bring back, by using your original image layered on top, but mostly masked out, some of your original framing if you like the way that that helped to keep the viewer's eyes inside the frame, and it's pointing very nicely with like leading lines from the branches into the scene. Now, another recommendation from me for what to do for something like this, if you are going to mask and do something like that, keep it very soft and subtle. So let me show you how this mask looks now. Okay, like that. And what I would like it to do is be even softer. So in the properties panel for that layer and that layer mask, you go to where it says feather, and just pull it towards the right, and that will soften up what's, see, the mask gets even softer. So it just won't be too harsh a line between what you're adding back in and what is already in the scene. So that's one recommendation for how to deal with that. So just to summarize, the bottom line of using that Edit, Transform, Warp tool is that it lets you reframe a scene either to recapture how you saw the scene, but your camera did not capture it, or you can use it to recompose a scene just for artistic effect. It really depends on what you want to achieve artistically and what you want to emphasize. So that is the conclusion for demo number 1. Let's move on to demo number 2. Now, in this demo, what I wanted to do was show how to correct converging lines and framing. This is an image that I shot at Yosemite National Park. It's up at Mirror Lake. And what I want to do in this image is, as you can see, if you look at this image, let's always just start with an analysis of what we want to achieve before we start working so we know what tools to use. In this image, when I shot, I must have been tilting my camera up to deal with tall trees and tall mountains, because what I've ended up with is the converging lines of the evergreen trees. And let me just add a layer and point out what I'm doing here. Let me just grab the brush tool quickly. So if you look at these evergreen trees over here, they're really tilting in. And if you look at the evergreen trees over on the right, they too are angling in. And that's what when I talk about converging lines or keystoning, that's what I'm talking about, is those lines angling in. Now we're going to ignore, let me just get this off of here so it doesn't become a distraction. Set this back to the default colors. We're going to ignore this dead tree here because that is just actually tilting and dead and falling over. We're going to correct for these evergreen trees that were not tilting over like that in this particular example. So that is what I want to do, is slightly reframe this scene and then also to correct for the converging lines and the framing. So let's start the demo, and here are the steps that I recommend you follow. So first of all, as usual, you have your image opened into Photoshop. Let's duplicate the background layer by either dragging that, left clicking and dragging to the bottom of the layers panel to the box with the plus, so you get a duplicate layer, or while you're on the background layer, you can click Control or Command J and jump it up, and you'll end up with the same kind of duplicate layer. Now this time, since we do want to get rid of these converging lines, I'm going to show how to work with the Transform Perspective tool. So we come up to the top of the interface, to the Edit menu, Edit, come down to Transform, go to the Flyout menu, and come down to where it says Perspective and click on that. And you'll notice that as soon as we did that, we've ended up with this pink bounding box with these handles all around that we can pull on. Now, because my trees on the left-hand side of my image are tilting towards the right, which means to compensate, I want to pull them left, I'm going to just slightly pull this image over to the right before I start trying to correct the perspective. You have to look at where you need to correct for your image, but if it's tilting in one direction, you're going to be pulling it in the opposite direction to pull it straight back up. It's almost as if you put a tree around, a string or a rope around the tree, and you're pulling it back straight again. So I'm going to click in here, not on this little center icon, and just slightly pull this to the right just to give myself some space to pull the tree to the left. Okay, so now I'm going to, because we want to work with the upper part of the image, I'm going to grab this upper handle and I'm going to just pull that towards the left, and I'm watching my image as I do this to see when is the tree this tree, set of trees over here looking straighter to me. And this one is really my reference one because this is kind of hidden behind there. This tree is still looking okay to me, and this one has straightened up from what it was. So you can see it didn't take very far to do that. And you don't have to be too perfectionist, but depending on how level you keep this when you go, you may end up with some transparency when you're finished. Okay, so now let me look to the right and see if I need to pull. So this has already come out a little bit because when you pull in one direction, it compensates a little bit. So I'll do a little bit more there, but I don't want to do too much because I don't want to pull this off of it straight and I don't want to pull this off of it straight. So at this point, I am going to click on this check mark at the top of the interface to accept that transformation. So let's just, see. So you can see it's done a pretty good job of adjusting that perspective. And by me pulling that image a little right, so I maybe could have gone a little bit more, but that's okay. I'm not going to worry about it for a demo. The point is to just, you'll take more time doing these things. The point is to show you the tools. So I'm going to just label this. You have it for reference that this was Transform Perspective was the tool that I used on that. And again, pulled it in the opposite direction from where the image was tilting. Now, another thing I want to do, so I'm going to create a duplicate layer. So again, I'm just going to drag this down to the bottom of the layers panel to that icon that adds a new layer. And this time I'm going to do a transform distort. Hopefully I spelled that right. Yeah. So one thing I want to do here in looking again, analyzing the image. So I've made some corrections so far here just to get this image in these trees a little straighter than they were. And as I said, I'm not worrying about the dead tree that's falling over, just the healthy living trees. I find that as somebody looking at this image, I might get caught up in the foreground element here because it is so bright. So one thing I'm thinking I want to do to recompose my scene without cropping it and losing some of the depth of the scene is, and the height of the scene, is to pull this rock down a little bit. So what I'm going to do is again go up to the edit menu at the upper left, click on that, come down to where it says transform. So we're going basically where we just went, except this time in the flyout menu, come to distort. So edit, transform, distort, and click. And again, get the handles. Now this time I just want to pull the entire image down just a little bit so there's less of this bright rock in the foreground. I want to leave enough of a path through the visual path through the image so that somebody looking at the scene will be able to follow what's going on, but I don't want as much attention and focus on that light rock in the foreground. Now, one of the things, just to let you know what I'm looking at here too, so that you can look for things in yours, is as I'm doing this, I'm watching what's happening to this bush in the corner, because corners frame an image. And I'm seeing some of these little diagonal branches. So I'm trying to have it so that one of these little diagonal branches is leading into the corner of my image. So again, it becomes a leading line into my scene. So I just like to give you my rationale so you know things to think about for your own image versus just blindly playing with tools. Okay, once you get that where you want, if you optionally want to do that, you don't have to do that. That's not affecting perspective. That's me and my taste for reframing. So it's a tool you have as part of the perspective correction process. Click on that check and it accepts it. So now we're on that layer that had the transform distort on it. Now, I mentioned that these evergreens over here were tilting in. They got corrected a little bit when I did the initial perspective adjustment, but I think they're still tending to lean in a little bit. So now what I would like to do is try what we did in the initial demo and work with the transform warp a little bit so we can see a different use for it here. Okay, so again, click on that active layer, duplicate it by dragging it to the bottom of the layers panel to the plus inside the box there. And this I'm going to do transform warp. But this time, and remember in the initial demo I did a horizontal, this time I'm going to do a vertical. And we'll see if that can help us with these trees over here. I'm hoping that by working with the vertical, we're just working in this part of the image. Okay, so let's again go back to the edit menu, come down to transform, to the flyout menu, back down to warp like we did in the initial demo. Okay, and then we come to the options bar, which has our different splitting options. And as you know, last time we did horizontal, let's this time try vertical. And you can tell it's vertical because there's a vertical line in the center right there. Plus, if you hover over any of these, it'll tell you what the tool is. So let's left click on that. You can see it's active. There's a black behind it. And as I said before, look in my image. You can see I've got that pink line that I can pull out. And I'm just going to line it up here, so just so I get in with the bottom of the mountain. And once you left click, it locks it down so that you can work with it. Okay, so now again, my trees are bending in towards the left, so logic says, okay, if you want them to go to the right, you pull out to the right. So I'm going to grab, since they're bending in at the top, I want to pull out at the top. So I grab that little handle and I just start pulling that and see if I can get those. And I'm trying to watch what's happening with the mountain too. Yeah, so I'm watching some of these trees in here and seeing where they're going. And I'm gonna have some dead air for a minute while I concentrate. Yeah, so to me, like looking at this tree here, and this tree here, this one's really bending in, so that you have to look at the ones that are the straight trees that are just converging. So I'd say by pulling that out like that, it really helped. You can then try, and again, it's trial and error, so if it doesn't help, you can put it back. Then maybe working with this bottom line a little bit and pulling the bottoms of the trees back in to help straighten it out a little bit. Yeah, so I'm feeling pretty good about how these trees are looking now using this vertical transform warp. So again, top of the interface to the check mark, left click on that to accept, and let's just see, yeah, see that straightened that out. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. Now, this is all I had to show you for this demo, how to deal with the whole idea of converging lines, as well as using a subtle distort to reframe part of an image if you wanted to do that, which I did to pull the rock down so it's not quite so bright and prominent in the foreground. And really the attention with all these leading lines is being directed towards the mountain and the trees here. Now, one other thing is, I know when I was growing up and everybody'd say, oh, good, we have a nice bright blue sky to take pictures in. Well, nowadays it sort of is more of a threat than a promise that you have the blue skies. And you always think that the sky gods are with you if you have some clouds or something of interest. So again, this has nothing to do with perspective. It's just a finishing kind of a thing. So optionally, let me just accept this and say that, we're as far as the transforming the perspective, those are the steps to do. Now I'm just doing something optional, which is more of a finishing step. So let's say that this seemed kind of boring with the blue sky. Then we can do things like come up to the edit menu, come down to sky replacement. And of course, in Photoshop, we have the flexibility of being able to enter new skies. And I'm not going to go too crazy working with all the controls and whatever in the sky replacement interface. But one thing that's important to do is make sure the sky you add matches your scene or the quality of your scene. So I'm going to increase, since it's a pretty bright scene, I'm going to increase the brightness. And because this isn't a demo or tutorial about working with sky replacement, I'm not going to be working with all these other tools that I'll just accept it and say it's good enough for the purposes of saying that we can add a new sky to something like this, and then we can go from our original scene to something like that. And again, you might say, I kind of like that rock in the foreground. So the point is not whether your taste match mine. The point is, I just want to show you some tools that you can use and different ways to do the finishing. One more tip with regard to the sky replacement, and it's not a Photoshop thing so much as when you're out shooting. When I travel around places, and if I'm doing landscape photography or even architectural photography, if there are good skies, and meaning skies with some clouds or some interest in them, when I'm around places, I will just shoot shots of the skies without anything else in them, so that I'm basically collecting my own stock to use as sky replacements. And that way, I've found that I can then put a sky into a scene. If it happened to be there for, let's say, 5 days, and one of the days the sky isn't so good, I can put a sky in from another one of the days I was there, and it matches the scene. Because what I've observed when I go places, different places have different kinds of clouds or skies or qualities to the blue of their skies or whatever. And if you put a sky that wasn't from that area, it could end up looking like it's not from that area. So if you just shoot a bunch of spare sky-only shots to save, then if you absolutely need them to add some more interest to your sky, you have skies from the place you visited, and it just makes it look a little bit more realistic to the scene. So anyway, so that was demo number 2, and we're going to move on to the next. Okay, now this is demo number 3. And in this demo, what I'm going to show is how to change the vertical and horizontal orientation of a scene. Now, this is a composite that I put together from, I forget how many, maybe 10 images, 12 images I shot in a nature preserve nearby here where I live. And the thing is that they were all miscellaneous piece parts, and I just patched them together in Photoshop and constructed this scene of something that I thought represented the place. The trouble is, I was limited to patching together scenes I shot in different places. So it's not like I could do a lot of rotating and things like that as I was going and putting this together in the first place. I've since learned how to do those things. We can do that kind of stuff here now with the tools I'm showing you. But when I put this together, I didn't know how to do that. So what we're going to do is, if you end up with a scene where you'd like to angle it a little bit differently than you originally shot it, or if you put a composite together and you'd like to angle it differently, either horizontally or vertically, so bring it forward or back or side to side, some of the tools I'm going to show you here will help you to do that. And the trouble is, when we put things together in composites, it can end up with different types of distortion, or just like I said in the other demos, there might be elements of the scene that get more emphasized than you want them to be, or less emphasized than you want them to be when you look at it all together. And then you want to be able to adjust those things so the emphasis is where you want it to be. Now, let's just say, for purposes of this demo, that I want this to be a water story. I want this to be about the water in this slough, and the water, and are we having a drought, and what can people do to help preserve water and conserve water. Right now, a lot of the emphasis in this scene is right here in the foreground and a lot of this light sand. So can I figure out something to do with this put together composite to have more attention on the water in this scene? So that's what I'm trying to achieve, and we'll see how we do here. So again, it's opened into Photoshop. You can either left click and drag that to the bottom of the layers panel to the add new layer icon, which is that box with the plus, or do a Control Command J and you'll accomplish the same thing. Now, given the tools that I'm going to show you to work with here, let's convert this layer that's active to a smart object. So I'm going to right click in this empty area on the layer, get this menu and come down to where it says Convert to Smart Object and left click. And you can see that it's a smart object because it's added that little icon in the lower right corner of that thumbnail. This doesn't have it, this does. So this is, you can tell it's a smart object. Now, with that layer active, again, you've got the blue highlighting to show you it's active. We're going to come to the top of the interface to the filter menu, left click on that and come down to where it says and highlight lens correction and left click on that. And that takes us into this interface here, which is the lens correction interface. Now, just to point out a few things in this, first of all, you can see it's sort of tilting down from the front to the back. We have these tools in the upper left. The very top one here helps you correct for distortion. This next little icon here is a tool that's a straighten tool, so it looks like a spirit level. You have this next icon down, lets you move this grid around if it helps you to line up where straight lines are. And then this hand icon, if you get zoomed in on your image, you can use that hand to move your image around so you can see different parts of your image. If we come down to the lower left part of this interface for the lens correction, you can see it normally has metadata that lists the camera model, the lens, and the camera settings. You'll notice that there is nothing there for mine because, as I said, this was a composite that I assembled. So there was no way for Photoshop to recognize what camera was used, what lens model, because this is not from a real camera or a real lens. What that does is that tells you, if you look down at your data here, and you come all the way up to the upper right, I have to work with this as a custom image. If you are working on an image that's straight out of camera and with a recognized lens, you can try to work with auto correction and see if Photoshop includes your camera make, model, and lens. If it does, you can try the auto approach and see if it'll fix things up for you. If not, you're going to have to go to the custom tab. But let me just come back down here and show you what else I have. So I do have this set to preview so I can see what's happening in the image. And I like to keep mine set to show grid so it will help me line things up. You can definitely click that. It's a toggle. So if you want to click it on or off, you can. If it's distracting, after you've gotten something lined up, you can turn it off. Also, the default color here for the grid was a gray. And because I've got so much gray, I think it's hard to see in here. So you can just double click on this and you get a color picker and you can select whatever color grid that you want. And you can also select how tight or widely spread the grid is, and that's what this size is referring to. So I'm going to leave mine just like this. And as I said, because this is a composite and I know I can't use auto correction, I'm going to come over and left click on the custom tab and we get these different settings that can be used. Now, I had pointed out that there's this distortion correction icon at the upper left. I personally find that really hard to work with, and it just distorts things too radically. If I want to do any kind of geometric distortion, I prefer to do it right here on the right under geometric distortion on this slider. And you can see there's little icons at either end of that slider that show you you're either going to go wider or you're going to pull it in so it bows in. So it's either going to bow out or bow in. And I think for mine, just to do something, I don't know if it really needs it, but just to show you, I'm going to left click on this little handle here, the cursor, and that might be more than I need. So with that box highlighted, I'm going to try to come up here a little bit. I'm just watching the image. Okay, so I think that's enough just to say you can do geometric distortion adjustments here, and I definitely prefer it on that slider to over here, but you can experiment and see what you prefer. I don't need this area on chromatic aberration. I'm not seeing like that pink or purple or green fringing on my image. If you have it on yours, you can use these sliders here to effect and try to get rid of some of that chromatic aberration. And I don't want to be working with vignette here. So we're going to ignore that and come down to where it says transform at the bottom of this settings panel. Now, the first thing I said I wanted to do was try to angle this a little bit differently than just straight back to the mountain. Normally, if you have converging lines in a scene, you want to have something really interesting at the end of what it's pointing to. This is a mountain, but it's not super interesting. So that's why I think we want to get more focus on the water in this scene. So the first thing I want to do is try to angle this horizontally and see what I can do. So we come down to the horizontal perspective slider. And again, you can see there's icons at either end that show you which way it's going to transform. So I think I want to pull mine to the right a little bit. I'm going to left click and just start dragging and see how it's tilting the image. I think that's all right, actually. I think I'm going to leave that right there because it's just angling a little bit, but it's not too radical. And now because when I tilted that like that, it tilted the vertical also. So now I'm going to come back to the vertical perspective slider. And again, you can see with the icons, it's either going to angle it in or angle the bottom out. So I want to, on mine, I think bring this out because it tilted that way. Let's see here. I'm going to work with my up and down arrows. Yeah, so that feels pretty good to me because this feels a little bit more level. And then because I've ended up with all of this transparency here, I think I'm going to use the scale slider, and you can scale up or down. So on any of these, you can go in either direction. And I think for mine, because of this transparency, I want my image to fill more of the space and try to eliminate some of that transparency. There we go. Now, hopefully this will work. But the one thing I pointed out at the beginning with these little tool icons on the far upper left is this little spirit level for straightening. So let's see, I'm going to left click, and that is active because it's got the black behind it. And I'm going to try to find a horizon line to work with here. Now left click, and I'm going to hold the shift key, and I'm going to pull out a line here and release. And did you see it snapped to straighten that up to the horizon line? And because I altered it, it's making it look more angled than I would like. So I'm going to redo that with something that's more visible. So it's distracting because of the bushes and the hedges and the things in the background. But this is the first thing you get to that's a straight line here. So I want to use, in my case, my bridge as my straight line. And again, I'm not taking the time I would if I was doing it for a professional job. But again, you left click, hold your shift key, drag out that line with your little spirit level icon active, and then release. And that's better because now the first thing somebody's eye is going to go to is that bridge, and it's much more obvious that that needed to be straightened there. And again, you can turn off the grid if it's easier for you to see what's happening with that. Okay. Now let's move on here. Now, optionally, if you want to, and let's just accept this so we go back to the layers panel. Oh, one other thing I want to point out before we go on. So by making this a smart object before we went into the lens correction tool, what that allows us to do is when you accept your changes back to Photoshop into the layer stack, it creates these sublayers with a mask and with a little sublayer called lens correction. If you double click on that lens correction right there, it takes you back into the interface, go back to your custom tab, and it retains your settings. So you don't have to start over. And if you say, oh, you know, I really would just like to alter this a little bit more this way, or maybe a little bit less vertical, a little bit less horizontal, whatever it is you want for your image, you can make those changes and then accept it again. I'm just going to cancel because at this point, for purposes of demonstration, I want to leave this the way it is here. Now, as I said in the other image, I was able to move that rock down in the foreground because it was getting a little bit too much attention. I feel that even though, and let me move this up a little bit here, even though I've made my horizontal and vertical and geometric distortion fixes on this, I feel like there might still be a little bit too much foreground here. So I'm going to add a stamp layer. So in other words, I'm going to basically accept or make a composite of everything I've done so far, but without collapsing the layers. So left click on that new layer icon symbol there, right there. We get a transparent layer, and I'm going to use a combination of Shift, Control, Command, Alt, Option, and E to make this stamp layer. And I'll type it out so you can tell what I'm saying. Stamp layer. And basically, as I said, it's like a composite of everything that's come before it represented on one layer, but without collapsing. Okay. So now, if we wanted to, I can go back in and use my Edit, Transform, Warp again to distort and bring this down. So let's try that. So we'll do Edit, upper left, come down to Transform, fly out to Warp. And again, let's use the horizontal option here in the options bar in the upper left. Left click on that. And let's drag this out. And let's just, for mine, I'm going to come down to the bottom of this slough where the water is. And now I'm just going to start pulling. Once I left click, it locks that horizontal line. Gonna left click, and I'm just gonna start pulling gradually down both of these end handles. So I'm left clicking with my mouse and pulling down. And again, I don't want to crop because I want to keep the full original height of this image. And I'm watching my image to see where I'm going here as I do this. Maybe I'll push this up a little bit. So I'm not worrying about this part being straight down here because I'm watching where these bushes are ending up in the framing of that. And I'm looking at the framing of this in the corner. And the other thing to think about is you don't want a lot of tall stuff in the front of your images, distracting and keeping people from getting into your images. So I've left a visual path into this scene with the sand, so it's light and it draws you in, and that to me helps draw you to the water, and there's less foreground, so the emphasis can be on the water. So I feel pretty good about that adjustment I've just made to this image. So I'm going to go to the top of the interface, left click on the check, and accept it. And I think, at least for me, now from a perspective of correcting perspective, distortion, or making alterations to the horizontal or vertical angling of a scene, that's where this demo stops. And using the tools that I demonstrated, we were able to accomplish those things. So let me just see if it made a difference. Yeah, so you can see it did alter what it is we're seeing and how we're seeing it. Now you can argue whether you like the original better or not, but the point being that for your image that you're going to be working with, you do have the flexibility to reframe, to remove distortions, and to create an image that is a little bit different than how you captured in camera or what you captured putting a composite together. Now, again, optionally for you to think about, which goes beyond the perspective stuff. From a finishing perspective, you could do something like drag out an elliptical marquee. Let me just do something like this. And then you can use a brightness. So at the bottom of your layers panel in the adjustment layers, the circle with the line through it, grab a brightness adjustment layer. And you can see that right here where I dragged out that marquee, we've got that there. You want to invert this. So in the properties panel for brightness, which is right here, you can invert that mask that was created. So now it's not going to affect the center of your image because it's black. It will only affect the white on the mask, which is the white. And with the brightness, you can do something like bring this down and create a vignette. Now you can either go very dramatic if you want to do it, or you can just do it slightly. The other thing is with the mask active, and you know it's active with that white frame around it, you go to the properties panel for that layer and go to the slider that says feather and just pull it a lot to the right. So you make that mask really soft, and it just gives it, and you can also lower the opacity a little bit if it's not subtle enough. And you just give yourself a little bit of a vignette, and that keeps your viewer's attention in the center of the image. And again, depending on what you want to do. Now, if you have a sunset like this, perhaps you want to, I'll show you this too here. So let me just do another stamp layer quickly so that we can do this. So we go to, if I want to make this more vibrant looking for a sunset, what I would do is I'd come up to select sky. Photoshop is selected, you see the marching ants, it selected the sky. And then coming to the bottom of the layers panel to the circle with the line, which is the adjustment layers, I'd personally probably use vibrance. And again, I would click on that mask and feather it to keep it soft, so pull it to the right. We do want the white area at the top because we want to affect the sky. And what I want to do is with the vibrance slider, which is much better to use for more subtle color adjustments and saturation, I'd start pulling that to the right. And if you still want a little bit very, very subtle, don't go crazy with saturation. Saturation can really, really, really be overdone. Let me put it that way. So we added just a subtle, more sunset look. So we've gone from this to this. And the point is not to go crazy. The point is just to keep it looking like it could have been natural, even if it's more artistic than what you were able to get in camera. So that is the not only the end of how to work with the perspective and distortion and correcting distortions, but also some optional pieces you can think about of ways to finish an image. And we've got one more demo to go. And this is going to be my final demo. It is a shot I made at the Grand Canyon. And the reason I wanted to show this one is there is a ton of distortion here on the rim and how the Grand Canyon is appearing. And a little bit of funkiness going on here too. Because this was something I shot years ago, and it was a stitched panorama. And I made it up of about 6 or 7 individual shots that I stitched together in Photoshop. And let me just duplicate this before I do anything. So if you go to File, Automate, and down to Photo Merge, if you haven't used it before, that's the tool that you can use to stitch individual images together to make a panorama. And that's what I used to create this. And the way that we want to do this is that some of the problem was caused by the time of the by when I took the shot, the time I took the shot, and how I did the shot. So first of all, ideally, if you're going to take a series of shots and then stitch them together for a panorama, you should ideally be locked down and on a tripod. I did this handheld and I was leaning on a wall to try to help, and I tried as well as possible to rotate around the rotation point or the nodal point in my camera as best I could. But I was surrounded by tourists and, and I was moving fast and there wasn't room to set up a tripod. So I did what I could, and this is what I ended up with. So just to know, when you're capturing shots, some cameras actually will let you do a pano in camera, but if you do like to, do it yourself and stitch them together, that's the things to think about, is make sure you're overlapping each of your shots by about 30 to 50%. Make sure ideally you're on a tripod. If not, just be sure you're rotating around the proper nodal point or rotation point in your camera. And then one other tip is, even if you're going horizontally across the scene, I recommend holding your camera vertically, which again, when I took this, I did not do. It was earlier in my photo taking days, because then you'll get more content that you can work with and try to stitch together, and you have more flexibility of what you have to work with in post as well. Okay, so I've explained different things to think about in capturing a panorama. What I'm going to try to do here in this one is to try to fix the distortion in this landscape scene. And I'm going to do it as part of a two-step process using the perspective warp tool. So let's get started with that. So first of all, I have my image opened, and it's another situation where I am going to convert this to a smart object. So right-clicking in the open area, come down to where it says Smart Object, convert to Smart Object, and left-click on that. We get the little icon telling us that now this is a smart object. So as I said, I'm going to use Perspective Warp as the tool to try to work with this image. And it's a two-step process, and you'll see in a moment what the two steps are. So we come up to the Edit menu, down to Perspective Warp, not Puppet Warp, down to Perspective Warp, left click on that. And now again, if we come up to our options bar, which is what this area above the workspace is called, you can see here are the two steps. The first step is layout, the second step is warp. So we're going to start with layout. Now what you need to do is create four-sided, in other words, box-like perspective planes to divide up your full image. And you do need to cover the whole image, because if you just do one area and try to work with it, it's going to look like you're flapping a piece of paper in the wind. Your image is just going to start flapping around. So you need to cover the whole image to lock down the image. And that way it won't flap around like it's a piece of paper when you're working with the warp part of the steps. So as you're working with that, so if we have layout active, you can see that, and let me just show you. So one of the things I want to do, one of the main areas I want to adjust is over here with this dark rock area. So I want to move that up so it doesn't look so compressed from where it is. So I'm going to take my tool, and you can see there's, if you look in the center there's a little cross hatching. I'm going to just come down here and make my little box, because I said you have to have these quad-shaped planes that you have to drag around your image. And I'm going to go from top to bottom for mine. Now, it may be possible for yours that you need to just do a partial quad, but then you do need to box in or quad in all of those other areas consistently. So I'm just going to do top to bottom for mine to keep it faster. Okay, so now the next area that I might want to pull up or adjust is this big white rock formation here. So again, I'm going to left click, and I haven't done anything else, and I'm going to pull this. And as we get closer to these white handles, if you get close enough, they should just snap together. Let's see. Yep, did you see that? So now they just lined up. If they don't, you can just drag on the handle a little bit, and this came up a little bit, so I'm going to drag that down just so that it's with the bottom of the image. Okay, and then the final third, I'm just going to then click over here and do it. And again, I'm showing it this way. You don't have to do your image in thirds. You can be doing much smaller slices. You can do it in whatever pattern you want, but you just need to then follow that pattern across the rest of the image to be sure that that image is locked down. And then there's my final third to lock this down. And I'm just trying to save time so that you don't have to watch me doing an awful lot of stuff. Okay, so now that I have all of these quads, and this can come in just a little bit so you can see you can adjust with the handles as needed. All right, so once you get your quads and your planes all locked down across the entire image, no matter what pattern of them you end up using, then you can click the warp right here. That's step number 2. And when you do that, you can see it. I don't know if I can go back. Yeah, there we go. So look at how this looks on the image now with those pink lines and those black sort of tubes across there. Then watch the image when I click on warp. It takes a moment to think, and there you go. So now we've got these white lines, okay? So this is my step 2. So one of the things that you can do, and you want to be very judicious and not do it too much of an image or else you won't be able to work with it, is you can shift click on one of these, on a few or one or whatever you want to do of these white lines to make it ensure that whatever you do in that quadrant stays straight. So if I shift and then click on this line, see it's turned from white to yellow. And I think it's a toggle, so you should be able to shift. Yeah. So if you shift and click, I'm going to say, let's keep that straight so that we hopefully pull up that dark rock straight like that. If you have more quadrants divided up, I'd say don't use too many of these straight line things or else it'll get too funky for Photoshop to deal with it. Okay, so now, since I wanted to move this up, I'm going to grab this pin here and start pulling up. And I like to do it relatively gradually. And I watch the image and I just say, what is this doing? Is it going someplace I want it to go? And since it's trial and error, and since it's eyeballing it, you may end up going up and then coming back down. You know, you keep playing with it till it gets to the taste for your image. And I'm going to say, at least for now, I'm going to leave that where it is because I got that pulled up a little bit. Now let's go on and same thing here. I want to pull this rock formation up a bit. And this one you can see I didn't do the straight line on this side. So I'm just watching where I'm clicking and pulling on that pin. I'm also watching to see what's going on the rim of the Grand Canyon. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there for now because I know I can go back and adjust these, but I don't want to go too far extreme on any one of these. So then I'll come over to this corner handle because I want to pull this edge of the rim up. So it looks like how it looked when I saw it in person. It wasn't all tilted down like that. So this is a situation where I'm not trying to be artistic. I'm trying to get it back to how it looked when I saw the Grand Canyon. There was a ridge and a rim over on the other side of the canyon, and it didn't look. And you can see I'm pulling this lower left-hand corner down just a little bit. And I think this center handle can come up just a touch. Hopefully it goes up just a touch. There we go. So it sort of made this line follow, and I'm also watching whether this looks more plateau-y, which would be good. There we go. And this is off in the distance, so I'm not worrying about that. Might be able to pull a little bit of this out here and get a little. This was a wall over here, and this is the wall that I was leaning on, and it continued down this way. And I did a very wide panel. Okay, so I'm going to leave that like that, and you can see if your tree starts tilting, you can click on this, you know, just adjust it as needed. Okay, so once you get your image, and we're not going to spend too much time on mine, but you can just see that you can pull the handles up and down, you can angle them, you can, if there's an area you want to keep more straight, you can do that click shift to convert it to a yellow. If you decide, oh, I've made too many of these straight lines, or if I don't really need it after all, then just shift click on it again and it will toggle it off. Once you get your distortions and your adjustments the way you want them, then you come to the upper left here and click on that check mark, and those lines will go away. Okay, and let's see if we made this better. Yeah, so this looks like, the after looks like how I saw it when I took the picture. So using that perspective warp is an excellent way if you get a lot of distortion from how you shot your images, to do isolated corrections and fixes to the distortions in separate parts of your image and only affect certain areas at certain times. So that is the end of how to do that. Now, I am not showing anything in my demos that is not available in the commercial Photoshop. So nowadays they've just introduced a beta for doing this in painting and using AI, artificial intelligence, and probably could fill in this area. Another way for something like this, and I'm not going to bother to do it for mine because you're not going to be working on this image, but again, just some thoughts about ways to finish your images that have nothing to do with perspective and distortion. So once you get all the little corrections like the perspective, the distortion, any little bright lights that might be distractions that you want to use the cloning tools and get rid of, you can do that. Now I'm talking about, okay, now you can do the creative and artistic stuff. So you could isolate parts of your image and add more vibrance and saturation. When I saw this, it definitely was a bolder orange. Now, again, please don't go too crazy with the saturation, that it can really get overdone. But in real life, this had a more bold orange. So I would probably use a little bit of vibrance on this, not saturation, to bring this back. I would keep this area back in here dark and soft. Same with over here, because the further things get away from the camera, you get atmospheric perspective where they would be softer and darker. So I'd leave that alone. I might put a little bit of more vibrance in these purples. And again, for my own image here, what I might do to play that I'm not going to bother to do now is, again, because I'm not using any betas at this point in time, maybe when it's part of the commercial Photoshop, I might try to select this area over here and use a content aware fill and see if I can get some of this content that's in here to fill out over in here so I don't have to see this wall. But that's just optional things to think about. So those were the 4 demos that I wanted to show you in this video. And what we looked at were different ways to adjust or correct perspective in landscape and nature photographs using transform warp, transform perspective, transform distort, lens correction, and perspective warp. So those were the tools we covered today. So hopefully it will help you to recover maybe some of your travel photos or landscape photos that you've captured, and help you to present them in an artistic way that you can enjoy. Have fun. Take care.